What if the limits you obey are only ideas you learn to accept? Think the impossible tears down those invisible fences and teaches you to build bridges where others see cliffs. This book is a practical revolt against can't, a roadmap for rewriting your thinking, designing daring experiments, and turning wild visions into repeatable wins. Ready to stop wishing and start proving that the impossible was only a draft? Chapter 1. Dismantling the can't mindset. Most limits are learned. They begin as whispered warnings from teachers, parents, peers, news cycles, and 1,000 small defeats that accumulate into a credible story. You can't, you won't, it's impossible. The first task of anyone who wants to think the impossible is to dismantle that story, piece by piece. This chapter begins by teaching you to treat limiting beliefs like objects. Observe them, name them, test them. Don't accept "I'm not talented enough" as a fixed diagnosis. Treat it as a hypothesis that can be disproven. Start with a simple mapping exercise. For 1 week, write down every time you say or think the word can't, won't, or impossible. Record the trigger, the context, and what emotion accompanied the thought. This map will quickly reveal patterns. Perhaps perfectionism fuels paralysis. Perhaps social comparison feeds fear. Perhaps a past failure has been magnified into a universal rule. Once mapped, the second move is to chunk the belief into its components. Origin story, supporting evidence, emotional charge. Ask, who told me this? Which events seem to prove it? How does it feel in the body? Distinguishing memory from data is vital because memories can mislead. The third step is the micro-experiment. For each limiting belief, design a tiny test that would produce disconfirming evidence. If you believe you cannot speak publicly, aim to speak for 3 minutes in a no-stakes setting, a small group, a club, a recorded practice. If you believe you can't learn a new skill, spend 10 minutes a day practicing for 7 days and measure small gains. Keep experiments brutally small. They must be conquerable. The goal is not instant mastery, but the slow accumulation of disconfirmations that erode the belief's emotional glue. The chapter also teaches narrative reauthoring. Replace global statements like "I'm bad at X" with precise, time-bound alternatives. "I am practicing X for 20 minutes 3 times this week." Language matters because the brain models probabilities, not slogans. Finally, this chapter introduces emotional containment practices. When a limiting thought arrives, don't fight it aggressively. Observe it, breathe, and name it. Labeling reduces amygdala activation and gives you back choice. Over weeks, the map will shrink, experiments will multiply, and the word impossible will lose its tyrannical power. The first victory in thinking the impossible is simply learning how to change your mind. Chapter 2. Building imaginative competence, not fantasy but disciplined possibility. Imagination is often dismissed as daydreaming, but it is actually the rehearsal engine for reality. The people who achieve the seemingly impossible are not more fanciful. They are more disciplined in how they imagine. This chapter reframes imagination as a skill you train with structure, feedback, and constraints. Start with the distinction between fantasy and productive visualization. Fantasy wanders without plan, inflating outcomes without linking to behavior. Productive visualization is concrete, sensory detail, process steps, and immediate micro-actions. The chapter gives a practical protocol, the 3-layer visualization. Layer 1 is sensory fidelity. See here, feel the exact scene you want. Layer 2 is process mapping. What actions occurred in the 24 hours before that scene? Layer 3 is the next minute task, the simplest step you can do now to align with the vision. Practice this 3-layer drill for 5 minutes morning and night for 2 weeks on one goal. Simultaneously, develop what the author calls imaginative variability, Deliberately generate multiple versions of a desired outcome, including failure scenarios. The purpose is to reduce fragility. When your brain has rehearsed several routes to success, it's less likely to be hijacked by fear when the unexpected occurs. The chapter also emphasizes borrowing constraints from other domains. Engineers, playwrights, and jazz musicians use constraints to force creative pathways. Apply a constraint to your imagining. Imagine solving your problem with half the resources or in half the time. That constraint often reveals paths that a free-floating fancy would miss. Another section focuses on collaborative imagination. Use small teams to stress-test visions, inviting disconfirming questions deliberately. The aim is not to kill boldness, but to ground it. Finally, the chapter gives a short daily itinerary to cultivate imaginative competence. Minute 1, sensory visualization. Minutes 2 to 6, process mapping and micro-action. Minute 7, note 1, obstacle, contingency. Repetition creates neural scaffolding that turns imagination into a rehearsal lab for practical audacity. With disciplined imagination, impossible ideas become testable plans. Chapter 3. Micro-acts, macro-shifts, the practice of incremental audacity. Large leaps often feel necessary, but most durable breakthroughs are incremental and audacious at the same time. This chapter introduces the principle of micro-acts, deliberately small, slightly uncomfortable actions repeated consistently until they shift identity and capability. The paradox of thinking the impossible is that you rarely start with a giant act, you start with a slightly awkward one you can repeat. The chapter begins with an evidence framework. Choose an outcome and decompose its leading indicators into tiny behaviors. If your aim is to run a marathon, your micro-act could be a 5-minute walk on day 1, a 7-minute jog on day 4, and so on. If your aim is to build an audience, the micro-act is a single short post or a 1-minute recorded thought. The key is to calibrate discomfort so the act is meaningful yet sustainable. Next, learn to harvest momentum via stacking. After a streak of micro-acts, add a new one adjacent to the first. Let habits cascade. For instance, after consistently writing 200 words daily for 2 weeks, add a 30-minute research block. Over months, these stacks amplify into production. The chapter also warns about heroism pitfalls, trying to compress months of change into a weekend of intensity. Rapid heroics often burn out, incremental audacity survives. The author prescribes a practical cadence. Identify 3 micro-acts for the week, schedule them explicitly, track completion visibly, and celebrate quietly. Visibility matters because external signals reinforce internal change. The final section explores how micro-acts alter identity. Completing small but challenging tasks repeatedly rewires self-narratives from I try to I do. That identity shift is the engine of impossible results because behavior now aligns with new stories. The long-run lesson is crisp. Think in decades of micro-acts rather than days of dramatic gestures. Chapter 4. Reframing failure, the education of impossible learners. Failure is not a verdict. In impossible thinking, it is a feedback system. This chapter teaches how to convert failure into precision intelligence. First, adopt the language of experiments. Every attempt is a hypothesis test. We did X to get Y result. Document the hypothesis, the method, the result, and the inference. This discipline removes shame and replaces it with information. Second, practice rapid failure detox. After an outcome you don't like, take 3 corrective actions within 72 hours, clean up, extract 1 precise lesson, and design an immediate micro-test to apply that lesson. Action dissolves rumination. Third, avoid performance rumination and instead conduct post-mortems that are bounded and future-focused. Rather than replaying what went wrong as blame, ask, what is the smallest tweak that increases odds next time? Fourth, Cultivate failure maps, visual representations of attempted paths and their outcomes. Over time, you see which routes repeatedly produce signal and which are noise. Fifth, build a failure portfolio with calibrated risk. Allocate certain projects as exploratory with high tolerance for failure and other projects as execution where failure cost must be managed lower. This portfolio mentality preserves appetite for risk while guarding core assets. The chapter includes case studies of leaders who used systematic failure learning to iterate products, pivot careers, and invent new roles. Chapter 5. Resourcefulness, mobilizing hidden assets and creative leverage. The impossible rarely needs infinite resources, it needs creative leverage. This chapter redefines resourcefulness as the skill of discovering underutilized assets, time pockets, relationships, modular skills, and recombining them into disproportionate outputs. Start with an asset audit. List everything you can call on that isn't money. Time slots, friendships, past failures, partial skills, local communities, and free platforms count. Once listed, practice recombination. What happens if you pair two unlikely assets? Perhaps a weekend hobby plus a friend's network becomes a pilot service. The chapter introduces Rule of 3 leverage. Pick 3 assets and conceive one experiment that uses all 3. Next, learn to create optionality. Structure small bets that preserve upside and limit downside. Options help you explore impossible ideas without catastrophic cost. Then master framing to attract partners. Write one crisp sentence describing the problem you solve and the simple ask you have: time, introduction, test data. People rarely refuse clear, low-friction requests. Chapter 6. Momentum, mechanics, designing systems that carry you forward. Momentum is not magic, it is mechanical. Once you understand the parts that create forward motion, you can build systems that carry audacity past fatigue and doubt. The first piece is rhythm. Identify the minimal repeatable action that meaningfully advances your goal and protect it like oxygen. If the macro aim is a product launch, the rhythm could be one validated user interview every 2 days. If your aim is physical mastery, the rhythm becomes 3 focused sessions a week. Make the rhythm tiny enough that it resists excuses and significant enough to accumulate signal. The second piece is friction reduction. Remove unnecessary steps between intention and execution. If you want to write daily, put your writing app on your desktop and your notes where your eyes land in the morning. Reduce startup friction until the first micro action is automatic. The third piece is fail-safe design. Build redundancy and fallback behaviors so rhythm survives life's shocks. If travel or illness disrupts your primary routine, have a shorter alternative, 10 minutes of focused work rather than 0. The fourth piece is feedback loops that are short and honest. Track the one metric that shows real progress and review it weekly with curiosity, not judgment. A private dashboard, a weekly metric email to yourself, or a shared accountability check are all acceptable. The fifth piece is incentive architecture for long arcs, small celebrations, ritualized reviews, and public commitments that matter to a few trusted people, not to the masses. Celebrations refresh motivation. Public commitments create mild obligation without spectacle. Lastly, treat momentum like engineering. Map the decay points where momentum historically vanished and redesign the system there. Often momentum dies at the social friction points: unnecessary meetings, poor sleep, invasive notifications. Protect your system ruthlessly. When mechanics are in place, audacity becomes sustainable. The impossible advances one protected micro-step at a time. Chapter 7. The negotiation of time. Carving out inventive hours. Time is the most stubborn constraint, yet the most malleable if you negotiate it intelligently. This chapter reframes time as an allocable resource and offers tactics to carve inventive hours, slices of time structured for high creativity and output. First, find your cognitive valleys and peaks across the week and claim creative blocks in your peak periods. The goal is not quantity, but concentrated quality. Second, defend those blocks with rules. Use calendar armor, label blocks as non-negotiable lab, and communicate boundaries to collaborators in advance. Third, use batching to reduce context switching. Group creative tasks that require similar cognitive sets and do them back to back. Fourth, apply the concept of temporal dilation. Create longer subjective hours by prepping the environment, preloaded templates, ready-to-run experiments, and a 2-minute warm-up ritual that signals deep focus. Fifth, trade public busyness for private length, reduce shallow appearances, and increase fewer longer sessions where you can iterate deeply. Sixth, cultivate time arbitrage. Find times where others sleep or unwind, early morning, late night, if those times fit your rhythm. Use them sparingly. The aim is effectiveness, not martyrdom. Seventh, measure the return on time. Keep a simple ledger of hours spent and tangible outputs produced to identify high-leverage times. Negotiate with your life like a partner. Present a small plan to loved ones that shows how deeper work benefits everyone. The negotiation of time is social, technical, and diplomatic. When you intentionally carve inventive hours and defend them, impossible projects finally get the unbroken attention they require. Chapter 8. Risk Frameworks, Intelligent Danger, and Calculated Audacity. Thinking the impossible requires a new relationship with risk, not reckless bravado nor paralytic fear, but structured courage. The heart of this chapter is building risk frameworks that let you test bold ideas without gambling your life. Start with tiered bets. Categorize projects into exploratory, small bets with high learning, growth, scaled tests with limited downside, and core, critical operations where preservation is key. Allocate capital, time, money, reputation differently across tiers. The second practice is downside containment. What's the worst credible outcome and how do you cap it? If a partnership fails, can you exit without existential damage? Always design small protective collars, contracts, phased funding, staged rollouts. Third, normalize optionality. Small experiments produce options. Treat options as assets to be exercised when conditions favor you. Fourth, use probabilistic thinking. Estimate success ranges and plan for median outcomes, not fantasy highs. Fifth, rehearse contingency actions. Predefine stop-loss triggers and pivot rules so emotions don't drive emergency decisions. Sixth, diversify psychological exposure. Don't anchor identity to one project. When a single failure threatens who you believe you are, recovery becomes harder. Lastly, treat risk as information. Each small risky test returns new data that shrinks uncertainty. Frame risk as discovery rather than drama. With intelligent frameworks, audacity turns from dangerous rebellion into disciplined exploration. Chapter 9. Network. Algebra. Building alliances that scale. Your reach. Impossible ideas rarely survive on lonely genius. They scale on network algebra, the multiplication of reach through strategic relationships. The first rule is specificity. Be clear about the exact leverage you need from a connection, distribution, expertise, credibility, or resources, and tailor asks accordingly. Second, optimize for reciprocity velocity. Short, valuable exchanges create rapid trust. Offer a small, immediate win before requesting a favor. Third, exploit structural holes. Find two groups that don't speak and act as the bridge. That role creates disproportionate influence because you become the unique connector. Fourth, formalize micro-partnerships, short pilots, co-created content, and shared small bets that can be scaled without a full alliance commitment. Fifth, build a portfolio of introducers. 10 people who can open meaningful doors with a single message. Nurture those relationships with periodic updates and value. 6th, master the art of clean asks. Keep requests short, specific, and low friction. People say yes when the ask is obvious and easy. 7th, protect reputation capital by delivering quickly on promises and making every small joint success visible to the introducer. Network algebra multiplies because each small success expands the base rate of future support. The impossible becomes probable when leverage compounds through calibrated relationships. Chapter 10. The language of persuasion, framing to convert. Skeptics into allies. Ideas die in poor framing. Persuasion is the craft of packaging novelty into terms your audience can test and accept. The chapter begins with the simple rule: lead with the problem, not the solution. People care about relief from pain more than admiration of elegance. Second, use evidence-first storytelling. Headline claim, one clear metric, a compact user story. Third, simplify complexity into 3 core points. Avoid technical splintering that overwhelms attention. Fourth, appeal to shared identity. Frame your ask in the language of your audience's values and codes. Fifth, preempt objections by acknowledging the strongest counter-argument and answering it succinctly. Sixth, craft small bet asks instead of full commitments. Invite someone to try a prototype rather than buy a full system. Seventh, use social proof strategically. Curated testimonials and selective early user stories carry more weight than inflated lists. Eighth, rehearse persuasive scripts and iterate them based on real responses. Persuasion improves with data. Chapter 11. The discipline of patience, compounding. Playbooks for long-term. Wins patience is not passive waiting. It is active compounding with discipline. This chapter lays out playbooks that turn small behaviors into decade-scale advantage. First, adopt a 3-horizon plan. Immediate experiments, 0 to 3 months, scaling plays, 6 to 18 months, and legacy investments, 3 to 10 years. Allocate cognitive and resource budgets across those horizons to avoid short-termism. Second, compound relationships. Invest in people for the long term through small, regular support gestures, sharing work, introductions, and honest feedback. Over years, these deposits yield trust and leverage. Third, apply persistent curiosity. Monthly learning projects that expand skill adjacency. Over years, skill breadth multiplies impact. Fourth, cultivate financial patience. Prefer reinvestment over consumption during growth windows to increase optionality. Fifth, measure long-term progress with trend lines, not daily variance. Smooth noise to reveal signal. Sixth, ritualize endurance. Micro-reviews, gratitude logs, and health practices that ensure stamina. Chapter 12. Narrative design, crafting a story. Worth living into your narrative is the operating manual that translates values into action. Narrative design is the deliberate craft of creating a story that guides decisions under pressure. Start by writing a concise origin and purpose statement, 2 sentences that explain why your project exists and who it serves. Anchor decisions to that statement when trade-offs appear. Second, script the threshold scenes, the moments when doubt typically appears, and pre-write your response. This reduces improvisational error. Third, embed rituals that signal story continuity. Weekly letters, anniversaries of small wins, or public notes to your team that recount progress. Fourth, Chapter 13. Tactical visibility. Showing enough to accelerate. Without exposing, visibility is a tool. Used poorly, it leaks leverage. Used well, it accelerates adoption. This chapter teaches tactical visibility, how to reveal just enough to gain collaborators and users without surrendering strategic optionality. First, reveal outcomes, not process. Share concrete results and curated case examples. Second, use staged transparency, pilot to close circles, public proof points later. Third, release modular demos that showcase value without revealing full architecture. Fourth, cultivate a small cohort of super users or champions who can advocate without broadcasting underlying mechanics. Fifth, keep runway confidential. Public fundraising noises often degrade negotiating leverage. Sixth, practice message discipline. Simple headlines, crisp metrics, and one user story are superior to long operational diaries. Seventh, time your visibility to moments of readiness, when metrics cross thresholds that turn curiosity into conversion. Tactical visibility converts secrecy into momentum without bleeding strategic advantage. Chapter 14. Embodied Courage, Training the Body to Support. Bold thinking courage is embodied. Your physiology shapes risk tolerance, emotional regulation, and presence. This chapter supplies a practical regimen to align body and mind for audacious action. Start with sleep hygiene because cognitive resilience depends on recovery. Add short, daily movement that raises baseline energy and reduces anxiety. Use breath practices, 2-minute breathing sequences, to down-regulate panic responses before high-stakes moves. Incorporate exposure tasks that progressively enlarge tolerable discomfort, cold showers, short public speaking drills, or micro-rejections practiced in low-stakes environments. Nutrition and hydration matter because they determine clarity in crunch moments. Build sunlight and outdoor exposure to stabilize mood. Finally, rehearse embodiment rituals before episodes of courage, power poses, brief visualization, and specific vocal warm-ups. When your body is conditioned, fear becomes a navigable signal, not a shutdown switch. Embodied courage supports persistent audacity. Chapter 15. The Ethics of Impossible Work. Power, responsibility, and consequence. Playing big carries ethical weight. This chapter insists that thinking the impossible requires a moral compass as robust as your grit. First, assess impact, who benefits, and who bears risk. Center decisions on reducing harm while maximizing net benefit. Second, adopt transparency norms for stakeholders. Disclose material choices to those materially affected. Third, ensure consent and fairness in experiments involving people. Pilot test with opt-in cohorts and clear benefit communication. Fourth, avoid exploitative shortcuts that boost speed but erode trust. Fifth, design exit plans for projects that could harm if misapplied, mechanisms to halt and repair. Sixth, cultivate humility. Be willing to publish failures and to compensate harmed parties. Seventh, embed ethics into the team DNA through scenario training and decision checklists. Impossible work that ignores responsibility often collapses under reputational stress. When ethics and audacity align, scale becomes durable and generative. Chapter 16. Sustaining Momentum through Organizational Design. Momentum is fragile when it relies on heroic individuals. It becomes durable when embedded in organizational design. This chapter teaches how to structure teams, processes, and incentives so that audacity survives leadership changes, market noise, and the inevitability of setbacks. Start with core roles. Separate explorers, people who run cheap, fast experiments, from scalers, people who standardize and automate successes. Too often, organizations expect one person to both invent and industrialize. That causes failure modes where good experiments never scale. Design explicit handoff rituals between explorers and scalers, a 3-part dossier that accompanies any experiment deemed worthy to scale, problem framing, validated metrics, and a proposed module for integration. Second, create innovation windows, protected time blocks where team members can run micro-experiments without bureaucratic overhead. These windows must be sacred and budgeted. They are not informal hobbies but official parts of project roadmaps. Third, institutionalize the micro-failure protocol, a transparent process that captures learning when experiments fail, includes a short post-mortem template, and requires a single next-step experiment. The point is to routinize learning so failure never becomes drama, it becomes currency. Fourth, implement modular architectures, both technical and operational, so that discovery can be packaged and slotted. Modularity reduces coupling and enables teams to swap failing modules for improved ones without rebuilding the entire system. Fifth, align incentives with long-term optionality. Compensation and recognition should reward small, validated learnings as much as scale wins. If bonuses only reward immediate product launches, teams will hide experiments. Offer recognition for high-quality negative learning, meaningful disconfirmations that prevent larger mistakes. Sixth, scale governance in proportion to risk. Keep lightweight governance for exploratory work, but tighten controls as projects move to scale. This avoids the twin problems of chaotic experimentation and premature bureaucratic drag. Seventh, build care for momentum into hiring and onboarding. Teach new people the operating rituals, the dossier format, the micro-failure protocol. Don't assume culture will transmit by osmosis. Codify it. Eighth, reduce internal friction by minimizing synchronous meetings and using short async updates with clear decisions attached. Meetings that are status-only kill momentum. Meetings should produce precisely one decision or one experiment ticket. Ninth, measure momentum with signal-rich metrics, cadence, consistency, conversion of experiments to scaled components, average time from hypothesis to user feedback, not vanity metrics like number of features launched. Finally, protect the social fabric. Momentum is social and erodes with mistrust. Invest time in rituals that preserve psychological safety, weekly reflection sessions, public gratitude for experimenters, and small traditions that normalize iteration. When people feel safe to experiment, momentum multiplies because the organization no longer punishes the signals that create the next breakthroughs. Organizational design that sustains momentum is an engineering and cultural task. It deliberately builds the scaffolding so audacity becomes systemic, not sporadic. The impossible becomes repeatable when routines carry the work forward beyond any single person's capacity. Chapter 17, Learning Systems, Turning Small Data into Strategic Forecasts. Small experiments produce raw data, but learning systems convert that raw data into strategic foresight. This chapter explains how to design feedback architectures that transform frequent, low-risk tests into reliable forecasts for high-stakes decisions. Begin with the unit of learning. Define what signal means for your domain. For a product team, signal might be retention over 14 days. For a creative project, signal might be audience engagement rate on experimental pieces. Next, adopt a consistent labeling taxonomy so signals from different experiments can be aggregated. Without common labels, your database is noise. With them, you can identify patterns across seemingly unrelated tests. Third, implement rolling meta-analyses every quarter. Run an integrative review, not just of outcomes, but of experiment design quality. How many tests had control groups? What bias risks existed? And which operational confounders recurred? This analytic discipline separates methodological noise from true patterns. Fourth, use Bayesian updating as a formal habit. Begin with a prior belief about a hypothesis, then update that belief proportionally to incoming evidence from micro-tests. Practically, that looks like a weekly probability band for major bets that moves in response to batches of tests rather than gut calls. Fifth, design experiments with variance-aware metrics. Look for effects beyond mean changes, such as distribution shifts and cohort variances, which often predict long-term value better than single averages. Sixth, create a fast path for high-velocity insights, a short pipeline that takes surprising, positive signals from pilot to intermediate scaling without full governance friction, but with safety collars to limit downside. Seventh, invest in data, hygiene, and tooling. Small experiments frequently fail because measurement is inconsistent or contaminated. Lightweight dashboards, automated tracking, and simple integrity checks prevent that. Eighth, democratize learning. Make summarized experiment results accessible across teams in human terms. One-sentence insight, confidence level, suggested next step, so more people can propose follow-ups. Ninth, institutionalize hypothesis books, a living document where teams record current priors, active tests, and update histories. It becomes an institutional memory, inhibiting reinvention and supporting cumulative learning. Finally, protect curiosity, reward people for surfacing counterintuitive insights and for honest reporting. A system that privileges tidy narratives over messy truth will starve learning. When small data is channeled through well-designed learning systems, organizations gain the capacity to forecast, not by clairvoyance, but by disciplined accumulation of evidence. The impossible becomes manageable when uncertainty shrinks into predictable ranges that permit decisive moves. Chapter 18. Cultural Engines. Building teams. That embrace the impossible culture is the engine that amplifies systems into sustained practice. A technical process will stall without cultural fuel. A vibrant culture can convert scarce resources into outsized outcomes. This chapter lays out concrete steps to cultivate a culture that not only tolerates impossible work, but embraces it as identity. Start by naming cultural primitives, curiosity, candor, and craft. Make them explicit and non-aspirational. Write them into onboarding, performance reviews, and daily rituals. Second, model leadership humility. Leaders must publicly share one meaningful failure and the learning that followed. This normalizes risk and builds permission for honest iteration. Third, create celebrations of learning that reward experiments regardless of final success. Short showcases where people present negative learnings as prized knowledge. Fourth, design rites of passage for risk-taking. Small public commitments that confer status once completed, signaling to the organization that audacity is a track for recognition. Fifth, embed mentorship loops where experienced experimenters pair with newcomers for rotating sprints. This transmits tacit judgment that no handbook can capture. Sixth, standardize language around experiments. Use neutral words like test and signal instead of moral language like win or failure. Words shape emotion and action. Seventh, protect the margin for deep work. Cultural permission to say no to superficial demands must be institutionalized so craft can flourish. Eighth, diversify psychological safety by encouraging dissent early. Structured devil's advocate sessions before major bets surface hidden risks and strengthen proposals. Ninth, align promotion criteria to evidence-based impact rather than optics or theatrical leadership. Reward people who convert experiments into durable assets. Finally, maintain a culture of stewardship. Long-term thinking and ethical reflection are rewarded alongside audacity, so that scaling the impossible does not sacrifice reputation or social value. A culture engineered with these elements becomes an engine. It transforms individual courage into collective capacity and makes institutional audacity habitual rather than heroic. Chapter 19. Marketcraft, Creating Demand for the Unseen. Even the most audacious innovation fails if the market does not understand or accept it. Marketcraft is the discipline of creating curiosity, comprehension, and adoption for things people cannot yet imagine. The first step is empathetic translation. Convert the technical novelty into human problems solved. Relate features to outcomes in everyday language. Second, Use early adopter archetypes, identify micro-communities predisposed to experimentation, and design launch paths that let them validate and evangelize the product. Third, design low-friction demonstration loops, modular trials, proof-of-value offers, and sandbox environments where potential users can test the unseen with minimal commitment. Fourth, sequence storytelling. Start with a crisp problem statement, provide one visceral use case, then show a compact metric of impact. Avoid technical dumps that confuse. Fifth, leverage narrative accelerants, trusted third-party validators, tiny case studies, and curated testimonials that translate pilot success into social proof for broader audiences. Sixth, cultivate partnership funnels, co-create with adjacent players who can distribute your offering in exchange for shared upside. Partnerships scale trust faster than cold outreach. Seventh, practice market learning loops. Treat every user interaction as an experiment to refine messaging, pricing, and onboarding flows. Eighth, manage expectations deliberately. Under-promise early and over-deliver to convert curiosity into loyalty. Ninth, build scalability into the onboarding journey so early excitement maps to retention behaviors rather than churn. Finally, invest in cultural signals that frame the product as inevitable, a constellation of small cues, thought leadership, strategic partnerships, and specialty events that make adoption feel like joining a movement rather than buying a gadget. Marketcraft converts invisible value into palpable demand. Master it, and the impossible becomes not just achieved, but desired. Chapter 20. Legacy and Scaling. Turning improbable wins into institutions. The culmination of thinking the impossible is not a one-time triumph, but the conversion of scarce breakthroughs into durable institutions that outlast founding egos. This chapter shows how to design for legacy, structures, governance, and narratives that preserve the capability to create audacious work for the long term. Begin with institutionalizing processes, codify experiment templates, dossier formats, and learning systems into operational playbooks that new people can follow. Second, create stewardship roles responsible for preserving optionality. Teams that maintain small, flexible budgets to seed new bets and defend runway against short-term pressures. Third, design governance that balances autonomy with accountability. Local teams can run experiments while a central council ensures alignment with core principles and curbs systemic risk. Fourth, embed ethical review as an ongoing institution, not a checkbox, so scaling remains responsible and credible. Fifth, invest in talent pipelines, apprenticeships, rotating fellowships, and shared residencies that continuously refresh the organization's capacity for audacity. Sixth, capture institutional memory beyond documents, record oral histories, decision rationales, and failed playbooks so future leaders inherit context, not only artifacts. Seventh, build financial architectures that privilege reinvestment, reserve a portion of returns for long-term option creation rather than distribution-driven short-termism. Eighth, cultivate public narratives that frame the institution as a mission rather than a brand, linking present activities to timeless purpose. Ninth, design exit and handover rituals to transfer stewardship gracefully, mentor successors, stage visibility transitions, and formalize the transfer of values. Finally, measure legacy with broader metrics, social impact, cultural resilience, and the continued capacity to launch meaningful experiments decades from now. Institutions that scale the impossible do so by translating episodic courage into repeatable processes, sustainable funding, and a moral compass that keeps growth generative. Legacy is not immortality, it's the practiced capability to keep making the improbable possible for others who arrive later. Conclusion. From possibility to permanence, thinking the impossible begins as a private rebellion against a limiting script and ends as a practiced architecture for change. You've seen the vector: dismantle limiting beliefs, rehearse disciplined imagination, build micro-acts into systems, design organizational and cultural engines, master market craft, and finally convert wins into institutions. The consistent thread is the same: small, deliberate acts scaffold audacity into durable reality. Start today with one tiny, slightly uncomfortable action. Protect it with ritual, test it with curiosity, share outcomes with precisely chosen peers, and document what you learn. Over time, these practices compound into capability. Momentum becomes inheritance, and the improbable becomes routine for your organization and your life. Think big, act tiny, iterate fast, and steward wisely. The impossible yields not to luck, but to design.